Welcome to this short video where I'll share some of the thoughts behind why we created the industry standard of Essence and why we chose cards to represent practices and for how a team chooses to work. We usually learn new practices from other people, either directly or from information captured in books or on the web. Here we have a practice, use case modelling, as captured in this book. And in here we've got lots of useful information for me to learn this new topic. But if you're like me, then this book usually goes back on the shelf, gathering dust, as I get on with my day-to-day job. And often the really useful information is buried in the depths of the text of the book, and so it's hard to reference and use, particularly when I'm working collaboratively with my team. Here's another practice, Scrum. And we'll use that as our example, as it's a very widely used practice and one that you're probably already very familiar with. It's described here in the Scrum Guide by Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber, the creators, with the subtitle of The Definitive Guide to Scrum, The Rules of the Game. And in just 19 pages, it concisely and precisely describes the Scrum practice. But even this brief guide is rarely referred to day to day by teams, and who often have their own opinions and misunderstandings of Scrum, but they find it very difficult to bring that guide into their day-to-day work. Now, Essence uses cards, which focus on the essential elements, and they often bring clarity, which is often missing in long passages of text in books. The cards let us see into the heart of a practice, and because they have a standard format, we can easily compare, mix and match, and combine them from many different sources. So let's take a closer look at what's on the cards. Each practice is described by a few different kinds of cards. These first ones represent the overall patterns and principles with the Scrum pillars, the Scrum values, self-organisation, and a cross-functional team. The next few are more specific patterns that represent the roles. Here, the Scrum team, the development team, the Scrum master, and the product owner. The next ones represent what you do, the activities, starting with product backlog refinement, sprint planning, the daily Scrum, the sprint review, and finally the sprint retrospective. Now we come on to some really interesting ones which represent the key items that we care about and want to track their progress and health. We call these alphas as they are the most important things at the heart of a practice. Here we have the sprint, the product backlog item, and improvement. Finally, we also have some cards that represent the physical things produced, the work products. Here the product backlog, the sprint backlog, sprint goal, the increment, and finally the definition of done. The cards makes us think very carefully about which words we put on them, as each one has to compete for a small space, ensuring only the really essential information is captured. If we look closer at one of the patterns describing a role, here we see the product owner, we can see that it's responsible for maximising the value of the product, resulting from the work of the development team. They are the sole person responsible for managing the product backlog, ensuring the product backlog items are clearly expressed, and the product backlog is ordered, visible, transparent and clear to all, and the development team understand the product backlog items. We can also see that the product owner is part of the Scrum team, relationships to other parts of the practice. So just a few sentences, but all of the key information in one place. Let's look at an activity. Here the sprint retrospective. Once again, a few sentences to describe the activity and also a view on the competencies required, basically all of them for a retrospective. At the bottom is the outcome. Here we can see it's the improvement alpha and that it should be in a planned or beyond state. So that's the next thing to look at, an improvement. So this is the improvement alpha, a short description as usual, and then all alphas are described with a series of states that they go through, in this case from identified to planned to achieved.
Each state can have a checklist so that the team knows what it means to be in that state, and we'll use some of those later. Finally, we have the work products. Here, the definition of done. A short description, as before, and then these are described by a series of levels of detail, i.e. what information is required to be captured. The minimum information will be in the first level of detail, here, completion conditions listed. This one also has an optional further level of detail, denoted by the dashed outline. So there we have it, the essentials of Scrum described on these 21 cards.
We've seen what's on the cards, but the very fact they are physical invites you to manipulate them as you think about, discuss, and debate how you work. With the cards in your hands, you naturally group things together. You prioritise items. Maybe you sequence them over time. Maybe you can assign one to a certain person or a group of people. Possibly pick a card at random and use that as a topic to discuss during your retrospective. And generally use them to tell stories and relate them to each other. With cards, people are usually less precious about the process, so can easily add notes, tick things off, or maybe attach labels. And when used with a team, you really start to see the power of using cards, with always brief reminders of the process on them. It's great hands-on with a team, or even with the cards on an electronic whiteboard for a distributed team. Let me show you some examples of particular games you can play.
This game or technique is called practice mapping, and I'm going to be drawing a few lines and labels, so I'll grab a piece of paper here. The idea is to build a map for how individual ideas or concepts fit together. It's easier to understand individual concepts, but the true understanding of a practice comes with knowing the interrelationships between the parts. Building this map depicts our own mental model of a practice, so it's good for showing how you think and communicating it to others. Let's start with the alpha from Scrum that we just looked at, the improvement, and see what kind of story we can tell around it. Just looking at its card shows you its life cycle, from being identified, to being planned, and finally being achieved. First of all, let's think who's involved in this. Now the cards have roles on them. So the roles we have are the Scrum Master. They'll be involved in helping the team identify and manage the improvements. We have the Product Owner. They'll certainly be involved perhaps if the problem areas are to do with the backlog or how that's communicated to the team. We have the development team itself. They do most of the work, so no doubt they'll experience most of the problems and be involved in coming up with the solutions. We also have that role, the Scrum team, which is a combination really of all the others. So if I just put them next to each other, I don't really need to draw any lines or relationships. I've just grouped them to say that's our Scrum team, and they're really going to be the ones involved with the improvement, and we can identify that relationship. So for now, let's just concentrate on the fact that our first step was to get them identified. What are these improvements we're looking for? The next thing that we might ask is what activities are involved. And here we can see we've got the sprint retrospective, which is really about managing our improvements. So we might place that on the diagram and say, well, actually that's really representing what that relationship's about. But also with a bit of discussion, we might decide, well, actually, even though that is our mechanism and our key activity for managing improvements, we might actually want to identify them at any point in time. And then each sprint will also be doing our sprint retrospective. That will also be identifying. But it will also take us one step forwards because we're starting to think about how we plan the improvement. Now, where do improvements go? We want them to be addressed in our sprints. And sprint is an alpha, really showing the iterations we go through. So let's put that down, and let's show some kind of relationship between the two. It also has a work product, the sprint backlog, that is used to describe the content of the sprint. And here on the card we can actually see that it includes at least one improvement identified at the last sprint retrospective. So it's certainly not an optional thing to identify and plan in our improvements. So those two are related, and perhaps we could be a bit more precise now about our relationship. We can see there's got to be at least one planned per sprint. So who does that planning? Well, it's the Scrum team again, and we could draw in that relationship. And there's a particular activity for that, sprint planning. So we could use that and just place it there to show that that's how things are planned into the particular sprint. What we have so far covers how our improvement is identified and planned, but what makes sure that we've achieved a particular improvement. We'll review our sprint in the sprint review, and we have a particular activity for that, where it might come up. But really it is the next sprint retrospective that will review our improvements to see if they've been achieved or not. So we could add that into our diagram. So that's a story around one particular component of Scrum, the improvement. It's one you're probably familiar with, but it is often surprising to see the misunderstandings of such a common practice, which were revealed in this exercise. And it's even more powerful with new practices that you are less familiar with. One of the biggest challenges in implementing and scaling Scrum is having all team members agree on what Scrum is and how it will be implemented in the organisation. In training today, we start with a practice mapping exercise called Build Your Own Scrum, using the essence cards which provide the standard definitions of the Scrum components. Then, each team puts a copy of the cards on a flip chart with lines and labels that connect and explain the interrelationships. When the teams have an image of Scrum complete, every team then presents their Scrum to every other team. One of the participants in one of Jeff Sutherland's classes at Scrum Inc. said he learned more about Scrum in 1 hour with the Essence cards than he did in the previous 6 years of being on a Scrum team. We hope you see similar eye-opening benefits and insights when you try this out with your own teams. This next game is for performing retrospectives, and we call it Practice Patience as we'll be grouping our cards into columns. We can do this with any practice, or practices, but once again we'll use Scrum as our example to look at how we can improve. As you are probably aware, Scrum has an activity called Sprint Retrospective for managing these kind of improvements. There are many techniques for performing it, and this one makes use of the cards to guide us through examining how well we are performing the practice, in this case, Scrum itself. We are going to create a board to play on, but it doesn't have to be that formal. Here, I'll just put a few post-its on the table. Across the top, I'll label a few columns for how well the team think they performed that part of the practice. From great, to okay, to not so good. We can also use the vertical dimension to indicate the importance the team think this is for their success, to help prioritise things. So high at the top and low at the bottom. One common issue with retrospectives is people talk a lot about the problems, but sometimes fail to agree what improvement actions they're going to take. If we create a column for them here, it will be a reminder to not forget and make time for them. So now we can use the cards to help drive the discussion with the team and help us decide which column they go in and use the priority if we need to. If we start off maybe by looking at some of the roles. In this example we might say, well, the Scrum Master, the development team, No surprise, they think they're great. No problems there. When they start to look at the overall team though, they discover that, well, actually, there could be some improvements made there. And in particular, it's the product owner role that's causing a few issues. Not that they don't understand their role and they're good at their job, but actually they struggle to have enough time. So that's something that we need to improve because that's having some knock-on effects. So we'll put that in the not good column. And obviously here, we can also add some notes to capture the nature of the issue. So here we might say, the product owner needs some dedicated time because they're busy juggling perhaps multiple jobs. If we then look at some of the activities, we can see we've got product backlog refinement. Well, actually, they're not so good at that one. They need to get better at it. And partially, they have a quick discussion and realise that really it's because the product owner doesn't have enough time. So here, it's not planned in. It's done at the last minute because we're not sure of their availability. So we'll make sure we've got a note of that. The other activities we have in this example, we've got sprint planning, the daily scrum. They think they're great at that. The sprint retrospective and how they manage their improvements, well, they think they're brilliant because they've now adopted this particular way of doing their retrospectives using the essence cards. So that's certainly going to go in that column there. Then they look at some others. The sprint review. This one they think we're okay at it. We're pretty good at examining our work, but sometimes we have discussions about, have we really finished a certain item? And they discover really there's an item in Scrum, the definition of done, that should help them have some clarity on that. So that's something that they need to improve. It's not good enough. So we'll put it over here, and we'll just say that our note will say it's unclear. The team do not know what that definition of done is, and they're not using it all of the time. As we go through the deck, we might even come across things that the team wouldn't normally have brought up in a retrospective. Here's something that they've forgotten. They used to do it at the beginning, but somehow they've just sort of forgotten to do this sprint goal. And that's a good reminder that actually we should probably do something there. We keep forgetting it. So we've got a few items now in our not good column. That's enough for this example, but really we want to move on to the next stage for improvement actions. Now before we do that, the areas for improvement are probably in the not good column, obviously, but we might need to prioritise things. We might decide that the product owner having good dedicated time for the team, that's the most important thing. When we discuss things, product backlog refinement, that might solve itself, I think, when that product owner gets enough time. Perhaps we should sort that one out first and then see how this one goes. So that might not need much action. The definition of done, yes, we need to do something about that. And sprint goal, that's perhaps a lower priority. So really it's this order, product owner, definition of done, sprint goal. So now we need to fill in this improvement action column so that we come out with some agreement as to what we're going to do about these issues. So the first one about the product owner, let's write a short note. So they need to agree with the business that they get a majority of their time to spend with the team. Definition of done, here, hold a workshop to update the definition of done and ensure it's referred to during planning, work and review. And finally the sprint goal, that's probably a small improvement action to make. Here we might just say, put the sprint goal on the sprint planning agenda and keep it visible on the planning wall. So that's the mechanics of how we use this board in practice patience. But the reality is that it's a team activity, and here's where the physical, tactile nature of the cards come into their own. Here's a team just starting their sprint retrospective using the essence cards, and it gets everyone involved, physically moving things around. It drives the discussion, and there's always the brief descriptions on the cards to stop debates about what the practice is. Here's some statistics that you might find surprising. Just over half of all Scrum implementations fail. Jeff Sutherland found that in training teams using the Essence cards, that the average Scrum team implements 1/3 of the 21 components of Scrum well, 1/3 of the components poorly, and 1/3 of the pieces not at all. Jeff compares this to like driving a car with 1/3 of the components missing, yet still expecting to get to your destination. So, how well does your team do Scrum? However well it is, the team can always improve, and we've seen how Essence can help you drill down into areas causing failure, identify specific parts of the component not functioning, and implement improvements over time. This next one will help us agree and understand responsibilities with a game called Contract Bridge. Software development is usually a team sport, requiring the coordination of people with many different skill sets. Another board on which to place the Essence cards is one with a simple line across it. I'll resist drawing on the table, and I'll just use a bit of tape to create two different areas. Separating the roles that will agree on how they will work together. This type of active discussion has proved especially useful among different parts of an organisation, or even when roles come from different organisations, such as in this example, where a customer is working with a development team from an external supplier. The card's vertical position indicates who is responsible for each concept. So for the roles, the customer is providing the product owner, and the supplier is providing the Scrum Master and the development team. For now, we'll just look at the activities. So we have product backlog refinement, sprint planning, the daily Scrum, a sprint review, and finally the sprint retrospective. With a collaborative framework such as Scrum, it's no surprise that many items straddle the line, and we can show if one side is wholly responsible, jointly responsible, or in this case, they take the lead. It's useful if the team add notes to either side to describe the nature of their expected involvement. So here, the product owner, they own the backlog, they prioritise, they lead, they explain, and they also arrange that event. While the development team and the Scrum Master, their role is to estimate and advise. So we can carry on with the others, agreeing who's involved, who leads, and what is expected from each other. We may have to make some compromises if, for instance, the product owner isn't available all the time. So we might make a note of their availability and adjust things accordingly. This game is great for involving people, showing them Scrum from their point of view, and a perfect way to start discussing how you'll be working together. In this game, we'll be able to see the big picture with something called the Essence Kernel. Most teams are used to tracking the state of the smaller things, like individual product backlog items or improvements. Essence helps by providing a clear description of the states that they go through, but even so, it's easy for a team to lose sight of the bigger picture. Essence refers to these things a team wants to track as alphas. It also describes a set of top-level key alphas that always have to be considered regardless of the specific practices being used. These universally applicable alphas are known as the Essence Kernel. They describe the stakeholders and the opportunity to address, the requirements and the system we are building, and also the team doing the work with a particular way of working. So this gives a broad, holistic view of our situation, independent of any practices. The different colours of cards denote different areas of concern. The green is the customer area of concern, the yellow is the solution, and blue is for our endeavour. If we look again at the alphas from Scrum, we can see where they fit in. The product backlog item relates to requirements. The improvement relates to the way of working. And the sprint relates to work. So we see that Scrum addresses some of these areas, but we mustn't forget the others. Even without other practices, the states of these items are very useful to us. Let's take stakeholders as an example. Here we see that stakeholders are the people, groups, or organisations who affect or are affected by a software system. So obviously we need to make sure we collaborate with them effectively. They move through 6 states, starting with recognised, then represented, involved, in agreement, satisfied for deployment, and finally satisfied in use. These state names may be understandable, but Essence really helps by providing simple checklists for each of them. The fact we can also have these checklists on cards makes them ideal to use in games and getting teams and their stakeholders to engage with them and help make decisions. If we lay our states with their checklists in a row, we can create a kind of abacus. As a team, if we think we've met the criteria, we can move the card across, so that we get a shared view of what we've achieved in a particular area. Of course, the next card along that we haven't achieved helps us also plan forwards, with items from the checklist making good candidate objectives for your next sprints, the kinds of things you won't find on your product backlog, but can make all the difference between success and failure. Many teams find that they make a lot of progress with their system, but often forget key things to do with understanding the original opportunity or not involving the right stakeholders in the right way. Here we can see Evar playing this particular game using all of the 7 alphas from the Essence kernel laid out on the table to get a good overview across all the areas. Here he's introducing Essence to a group of people for the first time, and what better way than to play a game with the cards of states and checklists, helping them assess a piece of work they're familiar with and working out what they've achieved so far and what their next step should be at this top level.
So we've seen some of the advantages of using Essence and the cards to represent practices, and also to facilitate our thinking and collaboration with our teams. Essence doesn't change the intentions of practices, but it does make them easier to learn, easier to adopt, easier to discuss and modify if needed, but most importantly, easier to use in our daily work. So reducing the gap between how we intend to work and what actually happens on the ground. Thanks for your time, and goodbye for now.